Hi, this is Richard from AgriFutures. I'm joined by Dr. Ozan Alakavuklar of Massey University, who's a lecturer of philosophy and does research on ethical assumptions and power dynamics in organizations. And we're going to discuss today some of the considerations of how principles can be used for the development of a business. Good morning. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Richard. Just a little bit correction, I guess. I'm a lecturer in management, School of Management. So,
okay.
but I have certain interest in some assumptions about philosophy and related power discussions and ethics discussions. So there's a connection, but not.
Yeah.
I'm not a lecturer in philosophy. I wish I could be.
So, have you come across the principles being involved in that aspect much of your work?
In different ways we use principles. I mean, in management, there are some theories like management by objectives. So you actually have some objectives and you develop some principles or assumptions on the way. And then you're assessed on the basis of objectives. For instance, this was a kind of approach in 1960s, for instance. On the other hand, you know, it depends on from which aspect you approach. From an ethics point of view, principles might be very important, particularly from a Kantian duty ethics. It's all about principles. It's all about rules to some extent, and which we can link back to, you know, 10 commandments as a kind of example. So there are certain rules that you follow, and in a very basic way you can actually explain treat others as how you want to be treated, like a golden rule. So, you know, there are different ways of approaching principles. Those sometimes guide the behavior, those sometimes are supposed to guide behavior, but sometimes, you know, they are just there. Or in the businesses, for instance, there are ethical codes of conduct, which can be considered also another example of principles. How to, you know, if you are going to have a gift from a customer or from a client, you know, what should be the value of it, or should you accept, or, you know, how you would manage this from a moral point of view. So there are, you know, in different spheres there are different ways of approaching principles, I would say.
And is it something that's developing more in businesses these days? Are businesses starting to consider that aspect more and how they run their businesses?
To some extent, it has always been there, and, you know, principles are mostly, if we take them as more kind of formal written rules and engagements, we can take this back to idea of bureaucracy, to Max Weber, who kind of came up with the idea of bureaucracy, of modern, you know, how to govern state, how to administer the state as a business, not as a business, but as a kind of organization. So all businesses, as we see around, actually based upon this premise that they have some basic rules and regulations which can be considered also as principles. On the other hand, if we take it from a more value perspective, it is something we can associate with organizational culture. So you get into an organization and it can be simply explained as, these are the things how we do, you know, these are the values we cherish, and this is how we do things here. So this is, for instance, very much relevant to values and practices in an organization, which we study as organizational culture. And each organization has different set of values, which may be impacted by, or which may be founded by the founder, you know, as the founder of the organization has a strong influence in this setting of values, in the set of values. And the more people join, it may have some variations, but most likely the values are tried to be protected or try to be developed further. So these values also, you know, guide through principles, you know, how to approach, for instance, you know, environmental concerns, or how to make things in an or work things out in an organization in terms of interpersonal relations, in terms of hierarchical relations. So culture, there are formal aspects, like we can refer back to bureaucracy, Max Weber. We can also have informal aspect in organizations which can associate with this values and more kind of informal structures, which we can see like in the form of culture.
Cool. And I understand an area of research of yours is alternatives to a capitalism type structure, so alternative kind of organizations and how
Yes.
to do that. And you were mentioning just before about how you tend to, and some of those organizations have a founder who's quite influential in setting the context of how that organization runs and probably the principles that underline it. But is there examples of how there's more collaborative thinking and how they collectively start to evolve their organizational structures and the principles that undermine that?
Yeah, that's exactly my area, and even I can talk more about them in relation to why studying alternatives is kind of important, and apart from that, how can we make sense of alternatives or alternative organizations? Usually, I approach from three different points of view. So when we refer to alternative, for instance, do we argue this organization provides an alternative economic offer? Does it offer an alternative ideology? Or does it offer an alternative kind of power relations? So they can be all interrelated though, so they are not really separated. But let me give an example. For instance, and sorry, there's also a very wide range of alternative organizations. We can think a sort of social movement, a sort of mobilization might be an alternative organization, which is very much guided by some values in a certain context in a certain time. A kind of like a spark. It may come together, bring some assumptions, practice these assumptions, and then it may dissolve, which may be based on some anti-capitalist or non-capitalist assumptions. On the other hand, for instance, there might be more well-established structures like cooperatives. Cooperatives might be also considered like alternative organizations, because obviously this also means what we mean with alternatives, because usually in business context, when we talk about business, it is more about corporation, and with corporation comes with whole set of assumptions about shareholder capitalism, short-term kind of orientation, manager as the agency of the ownership, lots of discussions about corporation. So this is taken as a kind of dominant form. On the other hand, when you look at alternative forms in terms of economic relations, then we can actually consider cooperatives as a really good example, because it is redistributed, the profit redistributed to all members, not to a specific group, but to all members, for instance. I obviously am talking about an ideal form here. There might be different variations, but this is a kind of example. Or there might be some community organizations which, in terms of assumptions, in terms of ideological perspectives, for instance, they may question some practices, some business practices, like extreme production of waste and food waste. So they can, for instance, come together and suggest, okay, let's organize our community in a way that we can actually get the surplus food and redistribute it. So this is a kind of another approach, both from an economic and also ideological point of view. So there are these.
Does that reorganization of the wealth and the surplus back into that structure have quite an influential role in the power dynamics and how the principles and the values of that system are evolved over time? Is that kind of the power dynamics?
Exactly. So, as I said, when I say this economic, ideological, and power relations, they are all interrelated. So the economic redistribution may actually create a kind of new assumption about ideology, and this new assumption may create a new power dynamic. Or you can take, for instance, you can change the power dynamic and you can intervene into the economic relations. So, they are all interrelated. So what you said is, I guess, very spot on in terms of, if you change the redistribution of wealth, obviously this may change how we do things and how we practice things from an ideological point of view, and also from a power relations perspective in terms of decision making, in terms of governance. So yeah, they're all interrelated.
How can that be brought into how a business runs? So if you've got like a small startup company, how can you incorporate some of those ideas into it?
I guess it is a matter of sorry, it's a matter of participation. To what extent? I wouldn't say like manage, there are some people who manage things. It's not like that. I guess it's all about a team effort. It's all about taking people into account and bringing them into decision-making processes, and then decide about how to do things. So for a startup, probably there are not many people, so there would be just founders, and they may bring some values which may promote some participative decision-making processes, and they can build this kind of mechanisms in due course. And in the long run, you can see that everyone has a stake in the organization, and they can give voice. They can take part in decision-making processes, and they would belong. They feel that they belong to the organization, and our organization belongs to them.
So it's quite a deliberate intention in how that organization is set up, and
yes,
decision-making processes run in that business.
That's what I believe. That's what I actually. I mean, if you have something in your mind, if you have a set of values about this kind of alternatives, I think it should be a deliberate kind of project. Otherwise, who knows how it will end up with.
And how does that tie in with the economic redistribution of wealth within that business? You're saying there's a more equal distribution of wealth and those kind of.
I would argue for this. I remember, obviously people, some may have additional responsibility, and they may perhaps have some slight kind of increase in compared to other wages or salaries, but overall there wouldn't be such huge differences between a middle level manager and top level manager, or usual worker or usual knowledge worker versus the top manager. I am highly suspicious of this principle, and I do not believe that it really creates much value when there is this high differences between salaries and economic redistribution. So from my point of view, if everyone contributes in organization, they should get their share accordingly.
And does it impact the nature of how those roles are formed? I've seen similar systems where people are independent, run their own independent business, and they work collaboratively as contractors, and they set up how they're going to run that system in a bit more of an individualistic context. So they may work collaboratively, but they run their own business structures, so it's not like being employed.
Yeah.
Does that kind of system play into that design well?
I don't know. I mean, for some it may work. So in social science we avoid this kind of black or white kind of assumptions. So probably there are some models working, but the question is, working for whom? Working for the owner. If the owner is after a huge kind of profit return, and not in a way of paying less for their workers, is it sustainable? Is it to what extent it is sustainable? Is there a kind of nice work atmosphere that people would like to work there or would like to contribute? There are always these kind of discussions, but it's also very contextual, very context dependent, very business dependent. It is now very common that many businesses are doing outsourcing. So there are two different business units, and this is also a very individualistic way of looking at things and doing work, which is another reflection of neoliberal era. Simply, neoliberalism is where we are really embedded into, in terms of how we think, how we do things, how we practice business. So this outsourcing is all about actually, cutting costs, and you do not really want to deal with employment and all these kind of requirements, and you just leave this to someone else and you pay for it, and you do not really bother about the conditions the outsourcing company provides.
Okay, so there's certain benefits to having that structure of a company with employers and employer with employees within a business.
Yeah, for whose benefit? Mostly we ask as critical scholars, for whose benefit this system works for.
Okay. And what role do you think principals have in kind of structuring the design of those sort of systems?
I mean, as I think before principles, I guess it's more about assumptions. That's my take. That's my kind of perspective.
Yeah.
You know, if you do business for why you do this business, what's your main assumption there? You know, is it you know, profitability? Is it sustainability? Is it, you know, or doing business with, you know, considering others' needs? You know, there are different kind of assumptions here. So this doesn't mean that businesses shouldn't do profit. Obviously, they should do profit, but you know, how this profit will be redistributed again? Who will get the lion's share? Is it fairly redistributed for the exchange of labor, for the exchange of people's effort that put into organization or put into businesses? So I think main assumptions are really important. For instance, if I would be given a chance to build a business, probably my main assumptions would be based on equity, fairness, and justice. And along these lines, I would try to bring people together, and then we try to do something, or you know, whatever we do. But obviously, it might be a bit challenging job. But there are examples. There are such cases in United Kingdom, for instance. John Lewis partnership. It's a departmental store, I guess. I'm not sure exactly how it can be classified, but you know, it is like farmers here. Yes, like farmers in New Zealand context. So everyone has a share, from the front office person to the manager. Everyone has a stake in the organization. They all work on the basis of partnerships, like a cooperative. So you know, I am going to these kind of cases so that these things can be done, and there are other, some maybe not very large but small scale kind of experiments and trials and errors, which, you know, promote this kind of everyone has a share, everyone has ownership, they decide together, they redistribute wealth together, you know. So there are these kind of models.
So
and
sounds
yeah,
like that's quite similar to intention. So, like your intentions of how that business is going to run, and you're mentioning earlier about the feedback of what actually happens. You know, informing those intentions or those assumptions and changing what you do. Would that be where the principles come in, perhaps? So, based on the feedback you're getting from those. Based on the feedback you're getting, you would then refine how you are structuring that organization to align with your assumptions or your intentions.
Inevitably, I guess. I mean, you know, you are not independent of the environment you act, but how I see is, you know, in terms of, you know, if you call it, you know, sustainable organizations, or if you call to fair organizations, whatever you want to call it, there's this competition, and it's very challenging. So there are those businesses who do not pay enough for their employees, you know, who do not respect environmental laws and regulations. So they found their way, and they kind of externalize all these costs to, you know, other stakeholders. And if this is the case, how you are going to compete and how you are going to survive in this kind of environment? I guess that's the feedback I would kind of get from this kind of market economy. This doesn't mean that you can't survive, but it will be much more challenging. And so all these things would be reflected in your organization, you know, how you do things, how you follow your principles, how you you know, realize, or how you make your assumptions work. So these are, I would argue, challenges.
And how do you start to collaboratively communicate what those guiding kind of principles are, and how you're going to use that feedback you're getting to achieve what your intentions are in that business? What kind of processes have you seen work quite well to kind of formulate how you do things?
Really, really good questions. I'm at the more kind of, it's not to escape, but you know,
Sure.
it's more like I'm at the more kind of theoretical aspect of it. So these are really good questions, that how you simply ask how you practice my ideals, or how I can practice my ideals, and that's actually what I study in some context.
Yeah.
In principle, what I would see is, or what I would do is more about, you know, making people participate into decision-making processes. So if, you know, if we see that there is a crisis coming, or if we see that something is not working, you know, we should come together with all these people who are involved in this process, and then we talk about it. You know, obviously it may take some time, it may not be very quick, but on the other hand, you know, people would have a say there, so they would feel like that they are part of the process. They put their labor there, so they do not get alienated from the whole, you know, process. And you know, if it's a success, then success for all. So it will not be my own success. It will be success for everyone, or achievement for everyone. So participation might be the key. Also, might be like a principle here.
So it's embedding those practices within the culture,
Yes,
making sure everyone is collaborating and participating, and how you formulate your plans moving forward and
exactly.
achieve your intentions.
Exactly. That would be my take. But obviously, this is a bit hypothetical. As I said, there are some cases working. Small-scale supermarkets, cooperatives, large-scale cooperatives to some extent. For instance, in Spain, there is this very well-known Mondragon. It's a huge manufacturer of durable goods. Even they began global operation, and now they are facing with, for instance, how to cope with, you know, operations in low wage countries.
Yeah.
So they're originally from Spain, and they do global operations. So from their own value set, or from value perspective, how it's a challenge for them how to manage this low wage country setting if they build a factory there, for instance. So there are all these kind of cases and challenges.
Yeah. And what are some of the challenges in the New Zealand context you see of embedding that more collaborative intention into how the workplace runs?
It's very, I would argue, it's very industries, very industry dependent, very business dependent question. You know,
is there an opportunity? Is there an opportunity perhaps in more startup entrepreneurial based companies to embed these practices into it and kind of leapfrog in front of some more established older businesses with which don't have the benefits of those structures, and they can kind of quickly develop themselves in new platforms that work more effectively?
Exactly. I mean, that I was just thinking about, for instance, dairy industry. What we have as, you know, economic actors there. We have a huge sort of cooperative like Fonterra. We have small cooperatives. We have family farming, you know, organizations. A kind of involvement of the government. You know, it's a huge kind of mess. And if you would like to get into this scene, how you would get in, you know, as an entrepreneur, what would your take is? Would you be a kind of egg research entrepreneur? It means extreme amount of funding. It's not easy, you know, to what extent you can have your own values and, you know, go on with these values. You know, very, very challenging situation, very, very difficult. But you know, if you just develop an app as an entrepreneur, you know, and if you go from there, what might be your take in terms of principles, in terms of, you know, sustainable organizations, you know? Well, so it's very, very context dependent, very business dependent, I guess. Okay. But yeah, I mean, it's a very the environment is very competitive, and it is mostly driven by this neoliberal ideals. So very I wouldn't say that it is not possible. I think it's always possible to do something differently, but it needs effort, time, and engagement.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been really interesting to hear a bit more about it and some of the possibilities of how you can incorporate it into a business. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope it helped.
Thank you.
Thanks.